Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? The first story this week regards the mysterious jars of the dead found in Laos. These are several ton stone sarcophagi type objects that have been used in theory to store the dead as they decompose in some sort of funeral rite. They are a megalithic structure from the Iron Age. Hundreds have been found, with some nearly 3 meters in height. Adding to the mystery of this site is the discovery of small clay versions of the large stone jars. Unlike the big version, these small ones were buried in bone pits, presumably with the dead. Then there is the discovery of large discs that have been carved out with great effort. This is all the more interesting when you consider the quarry where the stone, both the large jars and the stone discs would have been sourced from, is several kilometers away, which means they were transported to the location that they have been found on at great effort, time and expense for the Iron Age. A choice that remains a mystery to researchers who hope that further investigation may yield some answers. Moving very quickly into the modern age, there's been a simulation created that will show what a measles outbreak could do to your city. As has been repeatedly stated on this channel, measles is a very contagious disease which can easily be communicated between vulnerable individuals. In theory, this allows a very small and local issue of a measles outbreak to snowball into a far larger and more significant problem. This was done using a simulation system called FRED, that being an acronym for a Framework for Reconstructing Epidemiological Dynamics. By plugging in the actual data for school vaccinations from the state of Florida, the researchers are able to realistically represent the infection risk. The important part for this simulation is that it is intended to illustrate how herd immunity would stop the spread of disease. It would show the upper limit of measles cases that could be expected to occur as a result of an outbreak. They used two models, one in which immunization was adequate for herd immunity. This is generally accepted to be around the 95% mark. They then took a second simulation and they reduced herd immunity by 10%, meaning we're sitting on an 85% blanket vaccination rate. They then introduced one child with measles into this system. In the first instance, where herd immunity had taken effect, it led to 9 extra cases of measles for that year. Where you had that 10% decrease in immunization, it led to 800 cases of measles. This is by no means the worst instance, but it is a substantial example. Some of the most extreme could see up to 55,000 people infected with measles. This is worth bearing in mind as of May 10, 2019. The USA has eclipsed its entirety in 2018 measles cases, having diagnosed 839 individuals. Worse than 2018's 372 cases for 12 months, and the worst since 1994, remembering that in 2000, measles was declared eliminated in the United States of America. The backward slide is disconcerting, and prospectively going to instigate an epidemic. It is this fear and concern of an epidemic that has led other countries to initiate stronger measures against health professionals who are spreading anti-vaxxer nonsense. The Australian Medical Regulatory Agency, the Australian Health Practitioners Regulation Authority, along with 16 national health boards, have issued a statement warning practitioners that they have a responsibility to the public to promote evidence that vaccines are safe and effective. Australia is also seeing a rise in the number of cases of measles, with 83 confirmed in 2019 and 103 for the whole of 2018. In something of an ironic twist, this measure by the Australian regulators appears to be prophylactic. They are issuing the direction not because they believe anti-vaxxers are the sole driving cause, but in order to facilitate the public health measures that are necessary for the greater good. The regulatory agencies actually believe that a large part of the current increase in diagnoses is as a result of under-vaccinated individuals traveling to areas where the diseases are endemic. This is very much like what has happened with the Orthodox Jewish population in Brooklyn and travel to Israel. Going from vaccinations now to autism, there has been a number of studies over the years that have demonstrated a gross change in brain structure as a consequence, or possibly as a cause, for autism. Autism covers a spectrum of disorders, not only because it's difficult to diagnose, the diagnoses vary, or that the symptoms can be caused by a wide gamut of factors. For this reason, one group of researchers have taken individual cells from the brains of autistic children and have attempted to genotype them. What they found was that individual cells were having very difficult times communicating, particularly in the top layers of the neocortex. They also identified defective behavior in the microglia. What is perhaps most important of all is that they identified a direct relationship between the autism severity and the degree of expression of certain genes within these cells. Although it won't help resolve autism immediately, it does add substantial evidence to autism being partially a neuropathology. In other interesting research, scientists have filmed an immune system eating holes in bacteria for the first time. In recent years, scientists have been able to take video recordings of things like the electron shell. Areas like biology have made less compelling use of this. The recording in question took footage of the membrane attack complex, which is a group of proteins that are used to destroy bacteria. It does so by puncturing the bacterial membrane and creating holes that eventually lyse the cell. The process begins with the binding of one protein unit. 18 copies are needed in total to complete the perforation of the cell wall. However, there is a slight delay between the initial protein binding and the rest of the process, which is believed to be a means of having the self-identified cells prevent any kind of attack, which minimizes autoimmunity. The entire recording is one of a process that creates a hole 11 nanometers across. To provide some scale, a sheet of paper is about 100,000 nanometers thick, and a strand of human DNA is only 2.5 nanometers in diameter. Other researchers have been looking at creating a genetically modified organism, not for the sake of altering a single gene, but to create an entirely artificial genome, and the most recent work has created a new record with the most synthetic life form to date. The researchers were working with the Koalas, and their approach was to try and replace a number of genes with matching versions that did the same job. They targeted 3 genes, which are called codons, that provided function for the expression of serine, an amino acid. They also targeted another gene that was a codon that would stop the production of that gene. What they did was to take one that they knew the sequence of, and use the other 2, one or the other, to replace it in that particular stretch of DNA. In theory, this should have remained a functional and viable gene for its purpose. However, they have taken out and replaced one of the functional units 18,000 times. It was done on a piecemeal basis with successive generations of the bacteria having their genome swapped out, which meant they could work through the entire sequence little bit by little bit. The interesting thing here is that despite having replaced one gene for a functional version that should have been the same, it has had a slight adverse effect on the bacteria's ability to reproduce and the cell's size. The researchers describe this as the cells are a touch longer and they reproduce 1.6 times slower. Other than this, the E. coli cells are functional, while you have researchers attempting to understand and then modify life. Another researcher claims to have decoded the world's most mysterious book. The voynich manuscript was discovered in 1912 by an antiquarian, and nobody's really been able to figure out exactly what it says or what it means since, despite many efforts by cryptographers and linguists. The findings have been published in a peer-reviewed article, and although peer review is generally a reasonable control method, there is still a degree of uncertainty about their findings, especially when the rather miraculous claims are examined closely. For example, the researcher appears to believe that they know where it came from, who wrote it, and for what purpose. These claims are not very new, as there have been a number of people who believed that they understood just what the book was for. Unfortunately, most of these have tended to be disproven shortly after the claim was made. It would be a matter of waiting and seeing as to whether or not this particular interpretation has more substance to it. The next story this week is an interesting case study that was recently described. It involves a 67-year-old male who was infected with amoeba histolytica, a form of amoeba that was transmitted via sex. Although not rare, the disease in question generally doesn't get transmitted between people this way. It's picked up from water in regions where the parasite is endemic. Once ingested, histolytica will easily replicate in the human digestive tract. From here it will move into the bloodstream, and its next stop will be the liver. Due to sanitation, food, and water practices in the developed world, it's generally accepted that you are unlikely to pick up this particular amoeba. This is where this case study gets interesting. The man had never been outside of Europe, and if he had not been outside of Europe, he's unlikely to have ever been to a place that wasn't developed and had appropriate sanitation. However, his partner had been outside of Europe recently. In fact, they'd been on something of a world tour, going through South America, India, Burma, Vietnam, and Laos. While it's not unknown for this disease to be transmitted in homosexual sex, it's very rare for heterosexual sex to result in transmission of the amoeba. This has effectively made histolytica a form of sexually transmitted disease. Speaking of medical studies, there is a new bioglue being developed in China. In theory, this glue could be placed on an open wound and then activated through UV light, which would be very useful in open heart surgery, where it would prevent patients from bleeding out. The researchers claim that this gel can withstand pressures of up to 290 millimeters of mercury. This is a substantial improvement over what other currently available methods can handle. One of the study authors believes that this could be ready for human surgical use in the next 3 to 5 years, although this will very much depend on the authorization and regulatory bodies deciding on its value and whether or not it needs further evidence. The next story this week is a rather disconcerting article published in Science Advances. Researchers claim that an AI has developed a human-like sense for numbers spontaneously. By trying to train a neural network to be able to count things, the researchers have inadvertently developed a system that is able to create an aggregate idea of what it's trying to do and apply it intuitively. For example, the features that make an apple are not entirely unique to one apple image, and as a consequence, the machine has learned what these are and how to apply them in a more abstract way. For example, it may lump green and red apples together but ignore bananas. Conversely, slightly odd-shaped apples may be included in the count because the machine has recognized that they are apples. The researchers have been successful because they are mimicking a biological function. As they describe it, This has spontaneously emerged in a biologically inspired deep neural network that was trained on visual object recognition. These numerosity-tuned units underlay the network's number discrimination performance that showed all the characteristics of human and animal number discriminations as predicted by the Weber-Fechner law. While robots are developing the ability to count spontaneously, more than half of America reportedly thinks that they should not be taught Arabic numbers. You may not recognize the phrase Arabic numbers, but you would certainly know them on sight. These are your standard digits from 0 to 9, used every day for many purposes. The poll that gives rise to this involved 3,624 respondents. They were asked, should schools in America teach Arabic numerals as part of their curriculum? 29% said yes, 56% no, and 15% did not have an opinion. This has been used as evidence of bigotry in America, and arguably it could be. A more likely explanation is that it is a compelling example of scientific and mathematical illiteracy in the United States. This is all the more important when you realize the numbers are not solely Arabic, but instead are a product of communication and trade with India, where they were brought across via the Silk Road. As a consequence of both mathematics and the printing press, they were accepted as a more convenient means of describing the quantity of things, and then later as a simple symbol for the numbers in question. While speaking of scientific illiteracy, Bill Nye has received some kickback to his recent appearance on last week's Tonight with John Oliver, where he attempted to demonstrate in a significant way what global warming is, why we need to deal with it, and why the cost is a secondary concern.
Here, I've got an experiment for you. Safety glasses on. By the end of this century, if emissions keep rising, the average temperature on Earth could go up another 4 to 8 degrees. What I'm saying is the planet's on fucking fire. There are a lot of things we could do to put it out. Are any of them free?
While his actions are certainly eye-catching, unfortunately, this is the same man who recently denied sex differences.
One thing's clear about sexuality. There's a lot more going on than meets the eye. Female or male, gay or straight, pink or blue. We were taught to see these as binary. Now we're realizing it's more like a kaleidoscope. And this stuff isn't just for adults. Parents know this already. Kids explore gender, expression, attraction before they've ever heard of a spectrum. Take sex. We used to think it was pretty straightforward. X and a Y chromosome for males, 2 X's for females. But we see more combinations than that in real life. And even for people with just 2 sex chromosomes, hormones can vary wildly. So can anatomy. What makes someone male or female isn't so clear-cut.
Bill Nye was a compelling presenter in the 90s who instigated interest in science among many young people and those who were adults at the time. In recent years, he has increasingly found himself on both sides of the debate, where he has deliberately ignored science and urged politicians to pay attention to science. In this instance, his actions have certainly made his point. Global climate action is required. However, the way he's gone about it may not have been the most productive. It is still necessary, as it has been officially announced that atmospheric CO2 has just exceeded 415 parts per million for the first time in human history. In a recent satirical video on how to reduce CO2, this particular milestone was mentioned, as it is an irreversible point at which we are unlikely to be able to prevent a 2-degree rise in global temperatures. The last time the CO2 in the atmosphere stood at this concentration was some 800,000 years ago. Whilst the general consensus by environmental scientists is that we need to halt global warming, some geneticists have stepped forward to claim that we should stop human evolution. The argument is that evolution is the end product of mutation and adaptation to the environment. On average, these adaptations are not advantageous and will often prove prejudicial to life. This means continued evolution is likely to result in greater inheritance of traits that are adverse to life. The article from the conversation that describes the need to stop it and why appears to be based on the idea that under the current circumstances, where food, environment, and even health are largely dealt with through science, there is no need for evolution. Arguably, the anti-vaxxers believe otherwise. Overall, though, there is a case to be made that evolution at this point would be counterproductive. Then again, IHOP's recent marketing attempt for Mother's Day might prove there is a need for natural selection and evolution. They recently tweeted the following: "If you have pancakes in your tum-tum, does that make you a pancake mum-mum? Happy Mother's Day to all the mums out there." While showing a picture of what is presumably an ultrasound, the ultrasound shows a series of pancakes. Unfortunately, it also shows their lack of understanding of basic anatomy, as where the pancakes appear to be pictured is someone's uterus, which is not their stomach. In fact, there's a rather large difference in the location of each organ. Their demonstration of ignorance about the basics of anatomy is both entertaining and a continuing effort on their part to make advertising mishaps. However, they must be successful, as IHOP continues to remain in business. Next is a story about koalas. The Australian Koala Foundation has announced that they believe there are no more than 80,000 koalas in Australia, which makes the species functionally extinct. The term functionally extinct describes how a species is in a perilous situation in which it can no longer have an effect on both its environment or its ability to sustain its own population. This latter part could also mean that the population has dwindled to such a point that any future generations will be a product of inbreeding, which will inherently lead to a number of genetic problems, if not immediately, then in the very short term. This statement is backed by the very quickly dwindling population of koalas in Australia, despite the efforts by a number of organizations to try and sustain and reinvigorate the populations. Finally this week is the Bayer lawsuit. Unfortunately, Bayer has lost a jury trial on Monday, and the jury awarded more than $2 billion in damages to a couple, alleging the company's glyphosate-based weed killer caused their cancer. This is the third major loss by Bayer in the United States of America, and is the largest payout to date by a jury. As can be expected by a large corporation, they are appealing the decision of California's court. Having gone to California's Court of Appeal, First Appellate District, they are attempting to argue the following points: that the judge for the first trial created a unique structure in which they limited the amount of evidence the plaintiff could present. This is important, as Bayer attempted to present evidence from both the state and their own experts that found glyphosate did not cause cancer. The plan had been to present strong scientific evidence, but the decision by both the jury and the court prevented Bayer from doing that. If the appeal is successful, it could see a number of outcomes, one of which is a retrial. Another is there could be a significant reduction in the payments made, and, in an extreme case, there could be a dismissal of the case altogether, as the actions by the lower court may be seen as prejudicial. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions below.